Alright, so in this last video of how to convert the software on your TH9X radio transmitter, I'd like to end this with how to install the stock firmware on the radio transmitter. So let's say for some reason if you brick the radio transmitter while flashing OpenTX or ER9X, and if you want to go back to the stock firmware, then you can do that. And some of the Turnigy 9X users have reported a constant bad Eeprom data and they're unable to use the radio transmitter. So in that case, trying to install the stock firmware again could solve the problem. So let's take a look at that. So currently I have the ER9X firmware on the radio transmitter. And you can see that in the version screen as well. So now to install the stock firmware, I've connected all the jumper wires to the USB programmer and I've connected this to the computer. So now to flash the stock firmware on the radio transmitter, I'll go to the OpenTX website and I'll go to the Downloads tab. And where it says OpenTX 1 branch, we have the option of Companion 9X. So I'll click on that. And this particular version of the Companion is only available for Windows because the OpenTX firmware was developed on the TH9X platform. And this is the very first version of the software. So I'll download this. So after downloading Companion 9X, go ahead and install it. And now I'll need the stock firmware files. So here I have all the stock firmware files for the TH9X radio transmitter. This is the original firmware for the version 1 radio transmitter. And then I have the firmware for the second version of the radio transmitter, which comes with the second version of the frequency hopping protocol. And I'll link this firmware in the description so you can download the files from there. So because I have the updated version of the radio transmitter, I'll use this file. And you can either use the Flysky or the Turnigy software. It doesn't really make a difference. It's just that the branding is different. So if I select the Turnigy file, then I'll have the Turnigy branding in the software. Whereas if I select the Flysky firmware, I'll have the Flysky branding. But otherwise both the firmwares are exactly the same. So if you have the TH9X with the Flysky branding, you can use the Turnigy software. And similarly, if you have the Turnigy 9X radio transmitter, you can use the Flysky firmware as well. So that makes no difference. What you need to make sure is select the right firmware for the version of the radio transmitter. So just for the purpose of demonstration, I'll use the Turnigy file even though my radio transmitter is the Flysky TH9X. So I'll extract the files. And here we have two files. So one is the Eeprom data and the other is the software file. The important part here is the Eeprom data. If you don't have this, you won't be able to use the radio transmitter. And that's when you get the constant Eeprom error and you cannot use the radio transmitter. So let's install the firmware. So in the Companion 9X software, make sure that you have the programmer settings correct. So to flash the firmware, I'll click on this icon which says write flash memory. And I'll select the firmware file. So the .hex is the firmware file and I'll select that first. And I'll click on burn to TX. So now the stock firmware has been flashed on the radio transmitter. So once the firmware is flashed, you can click on OK. So I've completed the first step, which is to flash the firmware. The second step is to flash the Eeprom data. But before I do that, let me show you what happens if I turn on the radio transmitter. So I've only installed the stock firmware file and I haven't installed the Eeprom data yet. So let's see what happens if I turn on the radio transmitter. So you can see that it says Eeprom error and the radio has a constant beep. So some of the Turnigy 9X users have encountered this problem. And in that case, the radio is not usable. So trying to flash the stock firmware again could solve the problem. So now let's flash the Eeprom data. So to restore the stock Eeprom data, I'll click on this icon which says write Eeprom memory from file, and I'll click on load Eeprom. So I'll select the Eeprom file which is in .bin format, and I'll click on open, and it'll say that it's invalid binary but you can proceed anyway. So I'll click on yes, and I'll click on burn to TX, and I'll say yes again, and then click yes once more. So now the Eeprom data has been flashed on the radio transmitter. So once that's finished, you can click on OK. So after flashing the stock firmware and the Eeprom data, I'll disconnect the jumper wires from the USB programmer, and now I'll turn on the radio transmitter. So you can see that I have the Turnigy branding because I selected the Turnigy file while flashing the firmware. So in the version 2 of the transmitter, the only additional feature is the ability to select the sub-protocol in the output settings. So you can see I have PPM iBus, PPM SBus, PWM iBus and PWM SBus. So that's because I have the updated module which has the second generation of the frequency hopping protocol from Flysky. And the last thing I would suggest is to factory reset the radio before you actually use it with your model. So to do that, switch off the radio transmitter, hold the exit button and power on the radio transmitter. So that way all the settings are set to default. So if you want the Flysky branding, you can select the Flysky firmware. Otherwise it makes no difference. Both the firmwares are exactly the same because the radio transmitter itself is the same. It's just that the branding is different. So this is how you can revert back to the stock firmware on the TH9X radio transmitter. If you want to use the version 2 of the firmware file on the version 1 of the radio transmitter, then you can do that. Simply select the version 2 firmware file along with the Eeprom data and then flash it on the radio transmitter. And similarly, if you have the updated radio transmitter and you want to flash the original or the version 1 of the firmware file, then you can do that as well. Just make sure that you don't switch the Eeprom file from version 2 to version 1 or vice versa. If you accidentally select the wrong Eeprom file, then the graphics on the radio transmitter will be corrupted along with the settings as well. So in that case, you'll have to flash the firmware again with the right Eeprom file. So thanks a lot for watching, and as always, I'm sure you must have found this video helpful, and if you did, please make sure to like it and subscribe to my channel if you are new. So stay tuned for more videos, and thanks a lot for watching.